For the next project, we're going to look at the principles of design as our focal point, and kind of build off of that. In the last projects, we looked at the elements of design and how do we use line and shape and color and texture, value, repetition, and as we kind of go along. And now we're going to build upon that. How do we use those basics, those elements, to make and pay attention to a unified whole? Right? So here's kind of the principles or the terms or the tools. How do we organize the work that we're doing? In an ideal world, we've already kind of talked about the word unity and how do we create that. If we look at the others, we have balance, we have emphasis, we have rhythm, motion, and scale and proportion. And you can see them in kind of an order, and an easy way to remember them is burp them. Balance, unity, rhythm, proportion, emphasis, and motion. So we're not necessarily going to learn them in this order, but if you can maybe come up with an acronym that's easier to remember than this. But burp them. So we kind of use that as our starting point. How do we use these principles to create a unified composition, a piece, right? So we're going to talk one at a time here, kind of smaller bits, but let's look first at composition and just revisit that. So how do we arrange elements, position them? How do we place things? How do we place line? How do we place shape? How do we use color, and where do we place it to form a piece of design with intent? What's our goal, right? So we've looked at those terms before. We've looked at how we consider format and how do we think about the area where the square or the rectangle or the packaging, those kinds of things. How do we pay attention to those as we think about where we put elements, right? So we've looked already quickly at how do we use the margin? Do we use a bleed? Do we use a bleed on all four edges? Kept some flexibility there, right? So we've looked as well at thinking about alignment in general, and centered is safe, but how do we use the placement of elements in our composition? So some of this is a quick review of what we've talked about before as we kind of notice that, right? Centered is safe, but where elements share a common edge, they have more unity. And we looked at these three. We can have text as a dominant element, we can have image as a dominant element, or we can combine the two in a new way. Remember, our goal as we work in a design is unity. There's a harmony, there's a relatedness, there's a connection between everything. And we can do that through using similar elements, through putting similar elements together or elements in general. As we guide the viewer through, as we use the idea of closure, we don't need to see the entire structure behind it, right? As we create. So we can use negative space, positive space. How do we use that? And then how do we get the viewer to go from what we want them to see first to second to third, etc. And how we want to do this is the first thing to look at is just hierarchy. How do we guide the viewer? And how do we, or what do we emphasize, right? And then we can emphasize something that is largest. We can do it through color. We can do it through scale. We can do it through shape. We can make it different to emphasize something. Just one way of thinking about it. But how do we create and guide the viewer through visually? Some easy ways to think about this, or from some introductory ways to think of this, are isolations. We put an element all by itself, and that space gives us attention, or gives it attention. Think about its placement as well. Remember, centered is safe. Smack dab in the center is safe. Thinking about the scale of that element, thinking about the contrast of that element. If it uses all rounded edges and then there's one of the things with sharp edges, does that make a difference? Yeah, it does. Think about guiding the viewer through. So even using something like pointers. So these 5 are just a quick way to think about how do we create and guide the viewer. As we think about emphasis and hierarchy, we can, or how do we give importance? How do we attract attention? How do we do it with variety as well? How do we make it easier for the viewer to see what you're showing them, understand what they need, to know, and how do we get them to, what's the action we want them to do? How do we work more efficiently as well? Okay. So here's a website, and as we think about emphasis and hierarchy, does this website have emphasis or hierarchy? What do you see first? Yeah, there might not be much there. I don't know. Everything is exactly the same. So ways that we just looked at it make something different to give it hierarchy. But yeah, there's not much there. It's kind of difficult to read, right? And show you real quick here what it might look like. Here's their actual website, just really quickly. What does it look like? What do we have here? Well, maybe there's more hierarchy with this. I'm just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. You can check out this website on your own if you really want to. But there's at least some hierarchy here. It's not clear, it's not easy to read, it's not easy to scan, but there is a website there, or there is some hierarchy there. Compare that to something like this, different website, and this one doesn't have a link, so I can't take you there, but you might see something placed at the top versus the bottom. You might see something that is larger versus something that is smaller. You might see something that is has a color difference. A lot of different things to think about here. Now, there's probably some hierarchy, more so here than on that first one, but it could probably still use some work, right? Third one here, again, these are just websites that show hierarchy, show emphasis, and it depends on this structure. At least it's more formal. It has the logo at the top, and then it has, maybe that's what you see first, thinking about how we read in English. How do we read? We start in the upper left-hand corner, but then you also notice that you have this guiding line from the GTS companies, kind of guides you down to these 3 rectangles below that. And in there, you have a hierarchy as well. You have some text, and then some body copy, and then a button. So thinking about hierarchy as you build something, these are just websites, but thinking about hierarchy can be helpful, right? So how do we think about emphasis and hierarchy? What is the dominant element? What is the thing that we think is the most important? What is the focal point? So some terminology here that we've probably thought about before, but how do we pay more attention to it in our compositions? So 3 real easy ways to think about emphasis. One is contrast, and you can see contrast in a bunch of different things, and shape, value, color, texture, those are all elements. Contrast in elements. Another way to think about emphasis is isolation, so put it by itself. And then also think about placement. So if you put it in the center and middle, if you put it in the upper left, lower right, bottom left, foreground and background even, does that make a difference and help us create emphasis? So those 3 are helpful. So kind of building off of those, we have alignment. If something is not aligned in a straight line, in this example, as everything else, you notice that triangle first. If something is a different direction, if it's a different shape, if it's a different orientation, if it's rotated, those are going to help emphasize it, make it different. You can think through the nearness of something, the proximity of it. You think about the rhythm, and if there is a gap between the rhythm, maybe that can help. Or if something is larger in scale, or if something feels heavier, those can all give us a hierarchy of what we need, our emphasis. Okay? So I'll let you think through these just in your own mind. What do you see on the first one as the element is, what element is emphasized, and then how? So the first one might be rotation. You're drawn to the one that is rotated. On the second one, you might be drawn to the one that has a lot of space. It's isolated. On the third one, you might be drawn to the one at the bottom because it has more texture. On the last one, you might be drawn to the one that is in the background, but it is a different shape, it's a different color, and it's a different texture as well. So we can combine them. Now, you might all see those a little bit differently, but just a basic way of thinking about perhaps why you might see one thing different, one thing first, and then second, and then third. You guide the viewer through. Here's a related set of packaging. And if you look at the emphasis within these, you might see these shapes in the corner, bottom left, bottom right. From there might actually be some leading lines directing you to the text at the top. And then we have a text-based hierarchy. There's a logo, then there's the name, then there's some description, and in the very bottom, there's the quantity. So not necessarily in the order, you might see the text that's biggest before you see the logo because of color contrast difference, right? So we're just thinking about how can we create hierarchy there. Do we need to see the number of tablets before we see the title? Probably not, but we can draw the viewer in through the visual image of just the actual element creating this really interesting shape. Okay. So here's one that's maybe a little more challenging to think about. What do you see first? Might you see the square at the bottom, or might you see the red text in the middle? Either way, there's connection between those through the color and the type. So even if you start at the bottom, you see the red text at the top. If you start at the top and see the red text, you'll be drawn down through the color to the bottom. Most likely, they want you to see the text in the middle because this bunch of white squares, which are actually slides, it's this large shape that's drawn you into, that you are drawn into with some variety, right? So there's some of these slides that are straight, some are vertical, some are horizontal, some have a sticker, some have a subtle orientation, rotation. Just depends on what you think about, what you see. This has been used for years, creating emphasis. You might see these arrows being drawn to a house, which visually connects you to the Rural Electrification Administration in relationship to that and the word radio. On the right, you might see the text at the bottom, or you might see these nice curvy lines, which are actually a road, and I would never drive on myself. But you might see these white curved lines that then lead you into the text down at the bottom. So there's hierarchy created through all of these. We'll look at one last one here. What do you see first? What do you see second? What do you see third? We have a lot of repetition through color, through shape, through text. You see a lot of leading lines in the drumstick kind of, and the eyes looking at us or looking at where to go next. You might see the drum in the lower right corner and the text there, and then you see the line drawing you up and then moving around. But thinking about hierarchy is important. What do we want the viewer to see first? What do we want them to see second? What do we want them to see third? How can we emphasize something over something else? And as we're creating our designs, we'll start with that. So come back and watch this if you need to revisit some ideas, but we're looking at emphasis.